I think the dynamics remain consistent and worth looking at long term. Over the past, call it 7 years, the U.S. has had higher tariffs on China, at least on an average basis, than on any other country in the world. And so the basic analysis that we do still, I think, is relevant.
So walk us through what this means for Europe. You're suggesting that it could now be at the center of a new global trade order. Walk us through how that would come about.
Yeah, we look at the degree to which Europe is at the center of change, or rearrangement, as we call it. And effectively, we say, well, look, suppose the $441 billion worth of Chinese exports to the US as things stand today. And we say, well, look, if that amount of exports were to rearrange so that other countries were to fill a gap that might be left by China, what would happen? And the fact is that Europe is, in many instances, a natural replacement partner, export partner. And in many of what we call simulations, we see that it could replace roughly 200 billion of that. And then we say, look, on the other hand, if Europe were importing or exporting to the US rather than China, where might there be places that those European countries weren't exporting instead? And it turns out those are places very frequently also in Europe where China then might turn and become an exporter. So Europe is really in the center, both as a potential replacement importer to the US, but also as a replacement recipient of what currently are exports from China to the US.
Thinking about some of the numbers here, you're suggesting that Europe could actually absorb 35 to 55% of China's displaced exports. This is exactly what the European Central Bank has highlighted as a concern for their inflation outlook. But I'm wondering, how can this actually happen when, even though the European Union is seeking to have a closer trade relationship with China, they clearly have a lot of tensions between the two? So what is the evidence that you have that they can actually increase the trade flows between these two partners?
We say, look, all else equal, what happens if you try and rearrange trade between China and the US right now? And the fact is, at the moment, let me give you an example. And it's a sort of trivial example, but it's a good one. So take toys. Currently, China exports a lot of toys to the US. Europe, for the most part, actually satisfies its own needs in toys. So, for example, the Czech Republic exports a lot of toys to Germany. Now, suppose that instead of exporting to Germany, the Czech Republic exported to the US, replacing current trade from China. Well, then China would be in a position to export to Germany instead. And we go through 5,000 products in that mode. So long as trade in a product like that between China and Europe remains relatively unblocked, untariffed, there's a strong motivation to think that that sort of rearrangement could, in principle, occur.
Interesting. And that the example is actually quite visual and quite helpful, Olivia. But I also noticed in the report the example of Poland when it comes to their battery dilemma. Explain to us what is likely to happen here.
Well, again, this is sort of saying all else equal at the moment. And we look at an example where we say, look, at the moment, lithium ion batteries go from China to the US. On the other hand, Poland is a pretty significant producer of the same. So what if Poland were to export significantly more to the US and perhaps less to other countries in Europe? Well, would China fill the gap? Now, of course, one thing this doesn't look at is, well, what if Poland simply were to increase or ramp up the amount of production that it was undertaking in the first place? Now, if it did that, perhaps it could both fill a gap in the US and continue to export to other countries in Europe. TBD, as you say, the degree to which Europe would be open to new exports from China.
And just finally, Olivia, I would like to understand if there's any sort of number highlighting the costs for businesses amid all of this rearrangement of trades, because it is possible for some of these routes to be rearranged, but that will take time and money. Any indication of any sort of levels that we could see as a result?
Yeah, I think one real moral of all of this research is that the degree of granularity that you need to look at is extraordinarily important. And the fact is, in some areas, rearrangement will be easier and cheaper. So one example we give, for example, is cotton t-shirts. In other areas, for example, for business imports, expense and difficulty would likely be much higher because there you're looking at bespoke products made by an exporter for a specific importer, and there you'd look at higher costs. And so, to get a cost number, you really have to go true granular product by product.